Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Odin's movie blog. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope we're doing well, and today we'll be doing a little bit of a box office breakdown, but really it's going to be talking specifically about one film, and that, of course, is Charlie's Angels 2019, and how much this movie is likely going to be losing at this point in time. Now, as many of you all know, it's really easy, or becomes much easier, to predict how much a film will make by the end of its run after the first 2 weeks are over. And the reason why is because most films tend to make around 60% of their entire box office in the first 2 weeks of its release. The reason why, of course, is because that's when it has the most showtimes, the most marketing, and therefore the most people, numbers-wise, are going to be showing up to that movie within the first 2 weeks because people like to see things right away. So it makes a lot of sense that that would indeed be the case. The reason why it's around 60% is because there are some times when movies maybe have good word-of-mouth campaigns that keep people coming over and over and over again. And that leads to the film maybe making 50% of its entire box office in the first 2 weeks, or potentially even more in the first 2 weeks if it's a really bad film with really bad word of mouth. It makes a lot of sense, right? Because if you make 70% of the entire box office in the first 2 weeks, it means basically no one's going to see it after the first 2 weeks. If you make around 60% or so, that's pretty standard, and that is the standard that we'll be setting to Charlie's Angels, even though theoretically speaking, it could end up being a different number than this. So let us assume that the first 2 weeks now being over, that this is 60% of the entire box office. Well, if you do a quick little math in your head, if you times 43.5 times 10, you get 435. If you then divide that by 6, you end up around 72.5. Now, of course, that's taking the millions of dollars here and making it into simpler terms, which means that the film most likely will make $72.5 million by the end of its box office run, because if you put 43.5 over 73.5 or 72.5, it turns out to be 60%. So just a little bit of that math for you. I'll know that some people like visuals, but I try to break it into smaller numbers and speak a little slower during that part. So hopefully you understand the math behind it. So $72.5 million, that means that this film is not really going to have much of a chance of reaching that number of $100 million. Even if you were going to give this film the benefit of the doubt and say, oh, let's say that it only has made 50% of its box office, that would be very hard. In fact, it's really hard for films to be able to continue to produce after those first 2 weeks, which would be a 50% take. That means that half the people that have seen it are then the other half are going to see it in the weeks following the movie's release. That means that the film has to have some pretty strong legs, because after the first 2 weeks, you start to miss out on theaters, they start to take the movie out of several screens, and they start to do a lot of other things as well that are going to keep more people from seeing that film, especially if it's a movie that they don't want to really see again in the first place. So let's assume, though, that that is the case. Well, that one's a little bit easier to do percentage-wise, because all you need to do is multiply it by 2. Because of the way that the 50% works, right? So if 43.5 is half of what it's going to end up making, then the film overall would make $87 million. So that means that this film is set to make between 72.5 and $87 million. So even on the best case, even the best case scenario for this film has the movie capping out before it hits 100 million. Now, where does that come in for how much the box office is going to lose? Well, if it only makes the $72.5 million that it's expected to make, if indeed the percentages are correct, well, then you have to do some more math, because movie studios will only tend to get about 60% of the entire box office for the entire run of the film. This is based on the fact that they tend to get 90% of the box office in the first 2 weeks, and then much less than that after the first 2 weeks. And of course, other countries like China, they only give 25% to the box office studios, and the other rest of it is kept by the Chinese government, because obviously communism. That all being said, when all of these numbers are put in together and all of the money that's made by the end of a movie's run is put together, you get around 60%. Now, of course, this can fluctuate depending on the movie's release, depending on how big or how small the movie is, but it's the general rule of thumb. Where have I gotten these numbers from? Actually, a lot of industry journals. I did a lot of research of over a year ago when Solo Star Wars Story came out, because I thought it'd be interesting to dive into some numbers and say, hey, can we predict how much a movie will make by the end of its run? Is there any math out there? Found out that there was, and ever since then, I've been trying to use that to bring to the O's Movie Blog channel, to the Geeks and Gamers channel with my box office breakdowns as well, to try and give you a little bit of insight of what we can expect a film to make. So let's assume then that the 72.5 Again, the 60% number that I was talking about beforehand is that number. Well, it turns out then that 60% of that number is 43.5, meaning that the film only will get $43.5 million by the end of its run. That's as far as net gains are concerned, all right? So that's taking out all the other money that it has to basically share with the various countries and the various exhibitors, theater chains like AMC, Regal, etc., in order to show their movie. They get 60% of the number, so 60% of 72.5 would be 43.5, right? So that means the only net profit it would make would be this much money. Well, now we have to figure out, well, how much money did the movie actually make? Well, the production budget is said to be around $48 million. Let us round that up to $50 million just to make things a little bit easier on ourselves. So if it costs $50 million to produce, is that the total cost of a movie? Well, no, because that's just the production. That's just getting the film made. You now have to promote the movie. You now have to try and get butts into seats. That's going to cost a fair amount of money. Most studios and most industry standards and most industry experts usually say that the rule of thumb for that is 50% of your production budget, you will then add on top of your production budget, and that's how much you'll end up spending altogether. So what do I mean by that? It costs $50 million to produce this movie. 50% of that is what? $25 million. Okay, that means that they spent around $25 million just on producing the film, but that is a different number, right? So now you have to add that money to the production budget, meaning that overall the film costs around $75 million to make. To take the $2 million off, you're looking at it closer to being like $68 million or so. However, still, it cost a fair amount of money to actually that was $73 million instead. So it cost around $75 million to both produce and to promote this movie. Now we have that. That's how much it cost. So how much did it make again? Oh, wait, that's right. It made $43.5 million. Now this one, since it is a little bit more nuanced, I will nuance, like I'm using fancy words here. But anyway, so how much did it cost? $75 million, right? That's taking the $50 million production budget, adding the $25 million for marketing, $75 million, or at least around $75 million is about how much it costs to both produce and also to promote the movie. Well, 43.5 is what the actual gain that the movie is going to have after the 60% number is taken into account. So let us now subtract 43.5. That means that it costs $75 million. It's only getting $43.5 million, meaning that it will be at a loss of $31.5 million. Charlie's Angels, which only cost $50 million to make, will have lost $30 million, over $30 million by the end of its run if these numbers hold, which it's very likely to do because no one and their mom is really going out to go see this movie, and I would say it's for good reason. But this is the reason why it's a sad thing. When you have smaller budget films like this, films that cost half of $100 million, which is a standard now for most action films, most of the time studios expect those movies to at least do well enough with the general audience to be able to break even. And to say that a movie making $100 million is easy, I would say is a pretty standard thing to say. If you have as much marketing behind a film as Charlie's Angels did, if you have the big names behind a project like Charlie's Angels did, you would assume that that film would at the very least make $100 million, right? And that would seem to be enough to be able to make up the money that they ended up putting into the movie. But it's not even going to come close to that. It's going to come in about $25 million short of that. And if you take into account all these other numbers, you're looking at one of the worst box office returns in history. And what do I mean by that? I don't mean by actual raw numbers of dollars lost. I mean, you're losing tens of millions, $30+ million on a project that should have broken even easily. And that, to me, speaks all the volumes that I need to know about this movie, because if you're losing that much money, it tells me there's something wrong with your product. And it's not because men didn't go see it. It's not because of the patriarchy. It's not because of any of the nonsense that Elizabeth Banks wants to blame. She blames everyone but herself, of course. It's because broke, woke are connected to each other very intimately. And this is just one prime example of that. But anyway, did you enjoy this box office breakdown? It was a little bit more on the technical side, I know. But I want you to know why I waited for this first 2 weeks. because of the industry standards and how I got to the number that I got to. I don't ever want to just throw out numbers and you say, oh, I'm just going to assume that you're telling the truth. It sounds about right to me. Now you have your own way of understanding how I get to these numbers. And also now you can actually do it for yourself. So any other film that came out 2 weeks ago, go ahead and look at its production budget, take into account marketing costs, and you can actually figure out for yourself how much a movie will likely make by the end of its run, or at least the range of how much it'll make. Because again, take 50% as being the most the film can make, 70% being the least amount it can make, and that will get you a good range of how much money the film is actually going to make by the end of its run. I can't wait to do that box office breakdown for when episode 9 comes out, because that's a film that's going to be very interesting to watch how well it does in the foreign market, especially in places like China, where Star Wars has not done nearly as well, and then the domestic market, which did not show up for Solo: A Star Wars Story. And I cannot wait to do that breakdown for you. But anyway, what are your thoughts about Charlie's Angels losing $31.5 million? That's a loss right there. Some might argue, oh, it'll make that money up when it comes out on Blu-ray and DVD. But that's assuming that anyone's going to buy the Blu-ray and DVD, and definitely not $31.5 million worth. The only way that this movie can really make its money back at this point is if they have some kind of a crazy tax breaks that they're going to be getting in, or if they're going to make the argument that, oh, well, the studio is going to be working at a net positive for the year, and so therefore they can just write this movie off, and it's not going to be really much of a loss to them. And that might be true to the studio. But to people like Elizabeth Banks, to have this type of red mark next to your name of losing $30 million of a studio's money, they're going to think twice before letting her have another movie like this again. Let me know your thoughts about this stuff and all the things we talked about in the comment section below. If you like this video, smash that like button and give me a subscribe. It helps me out a lot. You are all amazing and beautiful people. Have a wonderful day. And as always, God bless.